Welcome back to part 2 on our conversation about ethics. This is namely having to do with the ethics of being a photographer out in the field doing photojournalism. Warning for this video, just like with the last video, some of the photos we'll look at are kind of hard to look at times. They involve some goriness, some death, so these are difficult, but these are things we will have to deal with. So now that we've talked about the importance of, hey, you have to be able to put yourself in the right emotional mindset and know that this stuff will affect you, let's talk about some other things to consider while being a photojournalist. One that's really important, I think, is kind of a golden rule here, and it is that ultimately you have to remember that you are a human being before you are a photographer. I think this is something that we lose sight of sometimes in journalism as a whole, not just photographers. This idea that we have to act like human beings. Even though we're there to do a job and tell a story, we have to put ourselves in this understanding and this mindset. A good example of this is a story I like to use, and it involves the really terrible earthquake that happened in Haiti a while ago. It was devastating. There was lots of destruction. Afterwards, Anderson Cooper went to Haiti to document the emergency relief, to document what had happened there, and namely how the West was responding to it. And he was filming a portion of his show, a portion of his program on the street in Haiti, down the road a little bit from an aid station where they had set up to have people from the community come in and try to get emergency wounds cared for. And into the shot wanders a child who had had some pretty severe head injuries and was bleeding profusely. And so immediately, Anderson Cooper stops what he's doing, goes and sort of picks the kid up, rushes the kid to a clinic after realizing that the kid's injuries were incredibly substantial and were going to be life-threatening if he didn't get to a clinic. And so he literally, in the middle of all of this, put his camera down, the camera he was shooting on, picked up the kid, physically picked the kid up, and ran the kid over to the health clinic. Now, all of this happened to be caught on camera because there was other folks there filming him for his show, and he was doing some of the filming on his own as well, but they filmed him, so they got video of this. And you can go on YouTube and find video of this. And a lot of the popular talk about it was positive. It's good that a journalist decided to do this. It's good to see a journalist actually act in favor of the people and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to pick this kid up and walk him over there. And so he was generally praised for it, and I think rightfully so. Because here's the thing, though. This is a very clear example of when you absolutely should help. This is a clear example of when it's very important to say, yes, I'm a human being. There's a kid here who needs help. I'm going to pick the kid up and walk him to the clinic where I know where it is. It doesn't take a lot of sort of questioning on your part to do that. Of course, you bring the kid to the medical tent. The issue is when we start to take this further, when we start to look at this case study a little bit deeper and say, okay, yes, absolutely, in that scenario, in that situation, you help the source out. You don't care about your story anymore. You help the person. You help the source. But where does this line ever stop? And when does it start to get blurry? When does it start to become a situation where, let's say an example like the earthquake in Haiti, where the damage was overwhelming and the amount of people impacted by this is overwhelming? So when do you have to look at it and go, you know what, there's only so much I as a single person am going to be able to do? At what point do you have to step back and realize that you can't put yourself out there for every single person, that you have to get your job done, you have to take the pictures? And maybe with the understanding that the pictures you take will lead to more people, when they see the photos, lead to more people donating goods, donating money, being able to help people out, raising awareness of the issue. And that's really difficult. There's no pure way of looking at it and saying, this is when you should get involved, this is when you shouldn't. As a matter of fact, we'll talk about this a lot even more when we get into our struggle assignment. But for now, let's rely on what the professionals say. The Society of Professional Journalists is a group of journalists and publishing organizations that have got together and created their code of ethics. And in the code of ethics, it is a set of standards that journalists should stick to. They're not law, but they're standards. And one of them says this: I think it's important for journalists to be cognizant of their roles in disaster coverage. Advocacy, self-promotion, offering favors for news and interviews, injecting oneself into the story, or creating news events for coverage is not objective reporting, and ultimately calls into question the ability of a journalist to be independent, which can damage credibility. And this is something that they sort of came out with during a lot of the questioning with Anderson Cooper. And I think the key point here is that it wasn't Anderson Cooper himself who said, hey, tune in tonight and you'll see me helping a kid. It happened to have happened behind him. He did it, and it actually, one of his photographers, one of his cameramen, released the video out without sort of his knowledge purely. So he wasn't doing it simply for the fact of making a good story. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. However, not everyone has followed this to a T. CNN, another CNN person, Sanjay Gupta, sort of got in trouble a little bit for going there specifically as a doctor and filming himself taking care of people. And there were sort of some ethical questions about him interjecting himself as part of the story that way. That this wasn't just someone wandering in behind the shot who needs help and then the reporter helping them. This is him going specifically to make himself part of the story. And it's kind of tacky. It blurs a lot of lines ethically. And I think in this situation, if Sanjay Gupta wanted to help, he should have either gone as a reporter to help or gone as a doctor and not had the cameras on him. I think either way that would have been a better situation than what he did. Which ultimately brings us back to this question: when is it going to be okay to help people? And how do you help exactly? And this isn't always a situation where you're going to have to travel across the world to find yourself in this situation. What if you're doing a story on homelessness in the area and you are interviewing and talking to homeless individuals who are people who are extremely poor, people who are dealing with poverty issues? What can you do to help them out? It could be as simple as offering them some food if you have it. It could be offering to buy them a meal to talk to them. It could be that you carry something with you. A good suggestion if you're going to be dealing with the homeless population is to buy prepackaged food and carry it with you, just as a conversation starter, just as a way to, hey, I got a granola bar here if you want it. Let's talk a little bit about what it is that your life is, how you go about your life on a regular basis. Because sometimes you do have the ability to help out a little bit. And sometimes that will simply be you, again, acting as a person instead of a reporter. But you do have to understand that sometimes you are going to be powerless. And there's situations where you're not going to be able to do anything to help. And that's really difficult to put yourself through as a photographer. And it leads us back to our very first point that we saw in the last video. You have to go into it with the emotional understanding that you're not going to be able to help everyone, and that sometimes things are going to happen that are going to be beyond your control. Photographers that were in Bosnia and Kosovo during the Bosnian War and the Kosovo War in the middle 90s, as that whole region was falling apart, the history of it, which some of you may not know, the history of it was that all of these former Soviet republics and former sort of Eastern Bloc aligned countries fell apart. A lot of nationalistic militias rose up and committed an ethnic genocide against Bosnians and against Muslims in the region. And because the people committing these crimes were not military, they were just militia. They were heavily armed, and oftentimes they were inebriated. They were drunk a lot, and they would go around killing people. This is a photograph. This is a really hard one to look at. This is a photograph of a Serbian militia member kicking the dead bodies of a family that he had just killed. And photographers specifically who took pictures in and around Bosnia in the 90s have had a lot of issues in dealing with depression, in dealing with PTSD, because they saw a lot of things that they considered absolutely tragic, and they were, but they felt powerless in the ability to stop them. And that's something that they've had a really hard time dealing with. It's something that is really and terribly difficult to deal with. And so know when you're going to be willing to step in, and if it's a situation where you're willing to step in, know that you can, and know that you can, as a human being, do something if you have the ability to do it. Lesson 3 here is when you're in tough situations, when you're in situations especially dealing with people who are going through a rough time, emergency situations, don't gawk, don't exploit for a good shot. Don't put yourself in a position where you can appear heartless or where you are kind of gawking over something that had happened. This is another example from Haiti, and this is a situation where a young girl was with a large group of people that were looting a store, and she had grabbed some picture frames, and then the store owner showed up, shot and killed her, and she was her body was laying on the ground outside of the store, or in an area around the store. She was laying there for about an hour before anyone did anything. And a lot of the photographs of this, particularly of this young girl who had died, became very popular, with people publishing photographs about the earthquake in Haiti and the everything falling apart in Haiti afterwards. There was a lot of photographs from different angles, right? So this is one angle. This is the same girl from another angle, people behind her. This is the same girl from another angle with the people who were then behind her moving around. And if you're questioning why there was so many photographs from so many different angles of this girl, you'll see in a second. The photographs themselves are incredibly powerful. They deal with the complete breakdown of society in Haiti after this earthquake and the chaos and death that happened there. These photos won a bunch of awards. They got the top prize in Sweden for press photography. They were a big deal. But then this photograph came out afterwards. And it was a photographer who had taken a step back and took a picture of all of the other press photographers who were who had surrounded this girl and were taking pictures of her dead body. And the photographer was sort of frustrated, who took this photograph was frustrated at the glibness that the other photographers were taking, that they were just sort of sitting around it, changing the angles, changing their lenses very casually. They were being very casual about the fact that this was a dead body in front of them. And when this photograph came out, there was a lot of questions of, are these photographers being heartless? How could they just sit around this dead body and take pictures? How do you emotionally do that? Part of the answer is that these photographers had been on the ground in Haiti for a week after the earthquake, and had seen so much death at that point that largely it was not affecting them in the same way it would affect other people. But I think the lesson here is this: if you're taking pictures in a situation where, for example, you're around something very serious like a dead body, someone who has been killed, someone who's been murdered, treat it with a sense of professional seriousness. Don't stand over the body and gawk. Get the shots you need and move on. Don't sit and act as if it is just any old thing happening. Ultimately, there's going to be two different ways of considering the ideological understandings of ethics here that you have to address, and find your own way in photojournalism of finding where you want to be. One is the Utilitarian Standard of ethics. And the Utilitarian Standard of ethics says this, that the greatest good for the greatest number of people is the ethical thing. That ultimately it is ethical if it will do good for lots of people. So taking these photographs is ultimately ethically good because people will see the photographs and care about Haiti. They will donate money, they'll donate food, they'll donate clothing. They will go and help in Haiti if necessary. So the idea of the photograph will inform other people about what is going on. It'll make them sympathetic. It'll make them more likely to change their attitude. And so the end justifies the mean. And compare that to the Absolutist Standard of ethics. This is another ideological understanding of ethics we can apply to photojournalism. And that would say that there are some boundaries that you simply should not cross, no matter the greater good. And so the idea of, hey, if the photograph that you're taking is going to hurt people when they're grieving, when they're suffering, then you need to avoid taking that photograph. You need to move on and try to approach the story from a different direction that won't immediately cause people direct harm. Neither of these are perfect, and you're going to have to find a way to bridge the two, but you should find a way that makes you comfortable. Ultimately, and this is very philosophical, but I hope you take this to heart, ultimately you have to be the one that lives with yourself after you're done with everything. You have to be the one who is comfortable in your own shoes when all is said and done, and the photos are submitted and the photos are published. This is the difference between Nick Oat and Nick Carter, or Kevin Carter, are two examples from the first video. They both dealt with tragic situations very differently, and it weighed on them emotionally very differently. And so you have to know that you need to find your own ethical code so that you can be comfortable with yourself, because it can be incredibly difficult. And again, you don't have to travel to the other side of the world to capture photos like this. This is a very famous photograph of a family who had been at a lake for a day, and one of their family's children, one of the siblings standing around, had drowned accidentally in the lake. And so this is them around the body of the child, in the body bag. Obviously, they're distraught. And they were really frustrated. The family didn't want this photograph to be published. The photograph ended up being published. And the photographer has since regretted doing it and talked about how ultimately the pain caused to have this photograph get out wasn't necessarily worth it. And so it's important to keep this in mind as you are working through it. This was sort of lesson 2 and 3 here, and they work together. And ultimately, your lesson is this: find your own ethical place in the world based on some level of ideology, and be able to live with yourself after you are done being a photographer.